Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into the world's most famous underdog story, but we're going to look at it through three entirely different lenses. You know the basic story, right? Boy meets giant, boy slings a stone, giant goes down. It's classic. But the source material surrounding this ancient battle in the Elah Valley is incredibly rich. And when you start looking at it through modern sociology, hard dirt archaeology, and ancient literary analysis, well, a completely different picture starts to emerge. So let's just jump right in with a pretty provocative question. Have we been reading the world's most famous battle completely wrong all these years? Seriously, does our basic Sunday school understanding of this story actually miss the original author's entire point? By the time we wrap up here, you might just find that the real lesson of the giant has, well, very little to do with slingshots, and literally everything to do with what we choose to put our trust in. Here is our roadmap for this explainer. First, the ultimate underdog myth. Then, the Gladwellian Startup Twist. Third, digging up the Elah Valley. Fourth, the ideology of arms. Fifth, rereading the ancient author. And finally, the giant's final lesson. Let's get to it. Part 1, the ultimate underdog myth. This is the story we all think we know. We've got to start with our cultural baseline here. We all picture it. A small, unknown shepherd boy stepping out onto the battlefield to take on this massive, terrifying giant. It is the absolute ultimate narrative of the weak overcoming the strong. And honestly, it's so ubiquitous. Like, remember in Mark Twain's classic, Tom Sawyer is pressed in Sunday school to name the first two disciples of Jesus, and he just blurts out, David and Goliath. It's a total cultural meme. It represents this perfect underdog victory, and it's so ingrained in our collective psyche that even a fictional kid who knows zero about the Bible knows exactly who those two are. Moving to part 2, the Gladwellian Startup Twist, substituting speed for brute strength. All right, let's pivot and look through our first lens, modern sociology and business. This perspective, which is heavily championed by thinkers like Malcolm Gladwell, views David not as some weak, helpless kid, but actually as an agile, highly calculating disruptor. This is exactly why startup founders are completely obsessed with this story. Notice the sheer tactical contrast between these two fighters. Goliath? He represents traditional warfare. He's heavy, he's slow, he's burdened by this massive armor, and he fully expects a hand-to-hand infantry brawl. But David? He represents disruption. He's agile, he completely ditches the traditional armor, and he's equipped with a lethal projectile weapon. That sling can strike from a distance before Goliath even has a chance to engage. Just to put that physical burden into perspective for a second, think about this number, 126 pounds. That is roughly how much Goliath's scale armor weighed. I mean, think about that. He is lugging around 126 pounds of bronze, and that's not even counting a spearhead that by itself weighed 15 pounds. So in this Gladwellian view, Goliath is far from invincible. Actually, his immense size and all that heavy gear make him a slow-moving sitting duck for a highly skilled slinger who simply refuses to play by the traditional rules of combat. So the real takeaway that Gladwell and others point out is summed up perfectly by the famous Israeli military leader, Moshe Dayan. He said that David's feat wasn't just being a brave little man. It was that he, quote, succeeded in finding a weapon which gave him, the weaker man, the advantage. From this angle, David's victory isn't some inexplicable miracle at all. It's a strategic masterclass. It's all about asymmetric warfare and swapping out brute strength for speed and total surprise. On to part 3. Digging up the Elah Valley and the physical reality of Khirbet Qeiyafa. But okay, let's step back and ask a totally different question. Did a confrontation like this actually happen? To answer that, we're going to pick up our second lens, archaeology. We're looking at the actual physical dirt of the Elah Valley, which is the exact location where this legendary standoff allegedly went down. Specifically, we're looking at an incredibly revealing site called Khirbet Qeiyafa. And the history of this site is just wild. For decades, it was practically ignored. It was first surveyed back in the 1860s and written off as just a random heap of stones. But jump forward to 2005, and archaeologists suddenly discovered impressive Iron Age structures right beneath those stones. By 2007, intense excavations revealed a massive, fortified city dating straight back to the 10th century BCE, literally the exact time of King David. And by 2013, they were digging up palatial structures decorated with imported Egyptian alabaster, sitting right there on the geopolitical border between Philistia and Judea. And the archaeological evidence they pulled out of this dirt is absolutely gripping. First off, they found these massive casemate defensive walls. That's a double wall design that is totally unique to the Kingdom of Judah.
They also found 2 distinct city gates, which led excavators to identify the site as the biblical city of Shaream, a name that literally translates to 2 gates. But here is the real kicker. They analyzed hundreds of animal bones left over from the residents' diets, goats, cattle, sheep, fish, but they found absolutely 0 pig bones, no pork whatsoever. That dietary clue, combined with the unique architecture, strongly proves this was not a Philistine or Canaanite city. It was a heavily fortified Judean flashpoint. It completely grounds our underdog myth in gritty, historical, 10th century BCE reality.
Part 4. The ideology of arms. Are we missing the ancient author's point? Now, as fascinating as those startup strategies and archaeological digs are, literary and theological scholar Abraham Khirbet points out something massive. He argues that both the sociologists and the archaeologists might be entirely missing the original author's actual point. And this brings us to our third and frankly most profound lens. Khirbet argues that the ancient text wasn't written just to praise David's clever use of projectile physics, and it wasn't about showing off the kingdom's impressive casemate fortifications either. Instead, the author was actively mocking something called the ideology of arms. This is that deeply held worldly belief that physical stature, abundant resources, and extensive combat experience are the absolute sole guarantors of victory. There is this incredible piece of irony hidden right in plain sight in the ancient text. When David volunteers to fight, the Israelite king Saul tries to dress David up in his own royal armor. But if you compare them, Saul's gear perfectly matches Goliath's. They are both relying on a bronze helmet, heavy body armor, and a heavy sword. It's a brilliant literary move. The author is showing us that the Israelite king trusted in the exact same failed ideology of resources as the pagan enemy. Saul was trying to fight fire with fire, and all it did was leave him paralyzed with fear. Part 5. Rereading the ancient author and the 3 false idols of the battlefield. Let's see how all of this builds into the narrator's ultimate theological critique. When we carefully reread the ancient author, we see a deliberate dismantling of what society values on the battlefield versus what actually matters to God. The author systematically tears down 3 false idols: stature, resources, and experience. Every single giant in this story relied on them. I mean, Goliath was obviously massive. King Saul was famously a head taller than anyone else in Israel. Even David's older brother, Eliab, had the impressive towering stature of a veteran soldier. And yet, every single one of them failed, or just cowered in fear. David, on the other hand, completely rejects these idols. He lacks the physical stature. He literally strips off and throws aside the king's heavy armor because he can't even walk in the stuff. And he is dismissed by pretty much everyone as a mere youth with 0 military experience. So what does he actually rely on? Well, instead of matching sword for sword or bronze for bronze, David brings 5 seemingly useless items into battle: a shepherd's staff, 5 smooth stones, a bag and pouch, and a simple sling. The text actually makes a huge point of contrasting Goliath's 5 heavy weapons with David's 5 pastoral tools. But David's true weapon, the one he shouts out across the valley, is the name of the living God. He counters the enemy's heavy artillery not just with a clever startup tactic, but with a total, radical reliance on divine intervention. And finally, part 6. The giant's final lesson: synthesizing the Rashomon effect. Okay, so how do we synthesize all of this? We've just looked at 3 incredibly distinct views of a single historical moment. It's almost like the Rashomon effect, right? Where the exact same event looks completely different depending on who is doing the observing. And honestly, this story is a literary and historical masterpiece exactly because it functions on all of these levels simultaneously. The modern sociologist reads it and sees a brilliant metaphor for agile, asymmetric startup disruption. The archaeologist digs in the dirt and sees the physical geopolitical reality of a 10th century BCE border fortress standing its ground. But the ancient author, weaving the whole thing together, sees a radical theological critique of humanity's absolute obsession with trusting in its own weapons and power. As scholar Abraham Khirbet so beautifully puts it, what God's people must abandon is the ideology of weaponry and power, a call for deconstructing faith in arms. The truest victory, at least according to the source text, doesn't belong to the guy with the thickest bronze armor, the sharpest sword, or even the cleverest business strategy. It belongs to those who completely abandon their reliance on human power. Which brings us right back to you, because we all face overwhelming odds at some point, right? So I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. Which lens are you using to view the giants in your own life? Are you trying to match them sword for sword, weighing yourself down with the heavy armor of that ideology of arms? Or are you willing to strip off that armor, step out with what seems small and insignificant, and trust in a power way greater than your own? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.